Welcome to AWS S3 Service and Architecture section. In this section, we'll take a deep dive into S3 Service. S3 is Amazon's object storage service. We'll look at what S3 Service is implemented, what are the basics of S3 Service, what are some of its important features. We look at the usage patterns on how to use S3 Service. Then we look at the architecture of S3 Service, how Amazon has implemented that service. And then we'll finally look at how to create an S3 bucket and how to start uploading files to it and how to start accessing those objects. So what is S3? S3, like we said, is Amazon's object store service. This is one of the first service that was implemented by Amazon. It is designed to provide secure, durable, highly scalable object storage. And you can store an unlimited amount of data in S3 bucket. S3 is also designed to provide highly available service at a very, very low cost. So let's talk about S3 basics. In Amazon S3 service, a customer can create one or more S3 buckets in their account. And in each bucket, there are multiple objects that you can create. You can create an unlimited number of objects in the S3 bucket. We'll talk about what S3 buckets and objects are in a second, but if from this diagram we can see the buckets are container for our objects, and a bucket is roughly equivalent to a directory or a folder on traditional file systems, and objects are equivalent to files. We'll see what the differences are between an object and a file and a bucket and a folder in a second. So the S3 buckets, like we said, are the container for your objects, and they are equivalent to directories in a traditional file systems. And the buckets can contain as many objects as you like. The one thing that we had to remember is our S3 bucket name has to be unique across all customers, not just in your own account, but across all customers. The bucket has to be unique. And we'll see how to create uniquely named buckets in the next section. The buckets have access control. You can control access. You also have the ability to control access either at the bucket level or at the object level. The objects, like we said, has the file at the data that you want to upload. In addition to that, they have something called metadata. The metadata describes the object. It has things like who uploaded the file, who's the owner of this file, and what are its permissions for that object. And the smallest object can be 1 byte, and the largest object that you can upload is 5 terabytes. And every object that you upload to S3 gets a URL. You can access these objects using either an HTTP URL or an HTTPS URL. So let's look at the concept of buckets and objects in detail. So let's say you have a file called logo.jpg that you want to upload to a bucket called my_bucket. When you upload this file to this bucket, you will get the URL http my_bucket.s3.amazonaws.com/logo.jpg file. The other concept we want to talk about is called an object key. An object key is unique within each bucket, and object keys are typically used to simulate subfolders. Typically, when we have file systems, we have directories and subdirectories. And when you want to simulate subfolders, you create prefixes and those prefixes are called object keys. For instance, let's say you have a bucket called my_bucket and you create this prefix called /images. Now when you upload that file logo.jpg to that prefix, the URL will have /images/logo.jpg. So essentially object keys are ways of organizing objects. So if you want to have files, let's say by directories, by dates, by user accounts, by customer ID, you can use the prefix customer ID, and then you can upload all the files that are relevant to that project or customer ID. Now let's talk some of the features about S3. Like we said earlier, S3 offers an unlimited capacity. There's no upper limit on the amount of files that you can upload to an S3 bucket. One of the most important selling points of S3 is it offers 99.99% availability, and it offers 11 nines of durability. Let's think for a second what that durability means. So the claim is if you store 10,000 objects on S3, on an average, you might lose one file every 10 million years or so. So as you can see, this is one of the highest durability that you can get anywhere. By default, everything that you do with S3 is secure. You need to explicitly grant permission for others to access those objects. They also have support for encryption at rest and for transit. So that means you can encrypt the files and upload it to S3, or you can ask Amazon to encrypt those files for you at rest. And when you upload and download those files from S3, you can use the HTTPS endpoint so that all the data is transferred securely. So the two features that we highlighted on this slide are the durability option, the availability feature, and then the security feature by way of encrypting the files at rest or in transit. The next feature we want to talk about S3 is the lifecycle policies. So what does lifecycle policy means? So let's say you have old files that were created 3 years ago and you don't want to store that using expensive S3 storage. You can define rules that say at certain point in time, remove all the files or delete all the files or move them to a different tier of storage, which we'll talk about in a second. So lifecycle policies essentially lets you manage, create, and store or delete the files when you want it. You essentially set rules and S3 will take care of the rest. You say this is the files for these kind of files. I want the files to be deleted, let's say after 1 year, and those files will be deleted from the S3 bucket. The next feature we want to highlight is the versioning support. So every time you upload a file, by default, the existing file will be overwritten. If you want to avoid that, if you want to save the previous versions, you can enable versioning support so that the previous versions are saved in addition to the new files that you're uploading. So you can have as many backup copies of the files as you like. So the next feature we want to highlight is the reduced redundancy storage, or RRS. In RRS, Amazon makes fewer copies of the data. So that means they also charge you lower cost for RRS. But this kind of storage is recommended for data that can be easily reproduced from the original data. So you want to use RRS for a derivative product. So some file that you have original stored somewhere safely, and you want to offer a lower resolution photograph, for example, or lower resolution video, you can use RRS to store that reproducible data. The next feature we want to highlight is static website hosting. So static website hosting allows us to host our entire website in S3. So obviously, like the name suggests, this is meant for static content only. So for things like HTML files, images files, JavaScript files, this is a perfect use case. Obviously, you cannot use static website hosting for dynamically generated content like PHP or Java files. So if your website is small, it has only static files, S3 website hosting, static website hosting is a perfect candidate. The benefit, of course, is you don't need a server to serve these files. Everything is served out of S3. And the reason we could do that is, if you remember from the previous slide, every object gets a URL. So if you upload your home page, let's say it's index.html, to your S3 bucket, then your entire bucket becomes a static website. The other feature we want to highlight about S3 is CloudFront support. So CloudFront is a service from Amazon that lets you deliver media files like photos, the images, heavy files that are typically generated once but reused for several years. So these kind of files can be served from an edge location, which means they are closer to the users and the users can download those files much quicker. So the CloudFront support typically requires a source of those files, and typically S3 happens to be the origin or the source of the master data. And the CloudFront service in turn copies that data the first time from the source or the origin and serves and continues to serve the data that is cached on the edge location to the users. The next feature we want to highlight is the Glacier support. Glacier can be used with S3 for that lifecycle policies that we talked earlier. We can use lifecycle policies to move older files or files that are not required anymore to a lower tier storage. And when we say lower tier storage, the cost of the Glacier storage is only 1 cent per gigabyte per month. Because of this low cost, a lot of customers choose to, instead of deleting the files, they might choose to move that files to a cheaper storage, to an inexpensive storage such as Glacier, and this is either for compliance reason or they may want to access that file at some point down the road. So Glacier is a perfect use case for that kind of use cases. So what are some of the usage patterns or use cases? S3 is perfect when you want to serve files that are written once but read many times, that stays on your applications and your company for a long duration of time. You can use S3 to distribute either software or document to your users. You can use S3 to back up your applications. Like we saw in earlier section, Amazon EBS uses its snapshots. When you take a snapshot, the snapshots are copied to S3 buckets. We talked about CloudFront briefly in the previous section. So S3 is most commonly used as the origin or the master of the source of those files. So in S3 we upload all the media files such as photos and videos and images, and let CloudFront serve those media files. We could use S3 as a disaster recovery and offsite backup solution. S3 is a very popular service and it's commonly used with a lot of AWS services. So how does Amazon implement S3? When you copy the data to S3, there are at least 3 copies that are made and that data stays within that region. So in this case, if you copy that to Europe region, the data stays within the Europe region. And every file or every data that you upload is an object. And for every object, you have something called an object ID. That's the way Amazon identifies that file. Okay? And that object has metadata information. In other words, who created the file, what's the size of the file, what are the ownership rights. That there are in addition to that, there could be attributes such as policies, the retention policies, the quality of service, the security aspects of that bucket. So how do we create an S3 bucket? So like we discussed earlier, the bucket names had to be unique. It has to be unique across all customers. So the most common practice is to add the domain name of the company. So let's say you want to create a bucket called media. So you typically you would then create media.mycompany.com. So that becomes the name of your bucket. Then we choose the keys or the subfolders like we discussed earlier. We set the permission of the bucket. The bucket is secure by default. That means nobody has access to those objects unless you explicitly give access to your other users. Then you upload the objects to the S3 bucket. Then you can set permission at an individual object level. Again, these objects are secure by default. Once you upload all the files, you can selectively give permissions to either users or to your EC2 instances, and then you start using those objects. So in summary, we learned what S3 service is. We learned some of the major features of S3. We learned the basics of S3, the S3 objects, S3 buckets concepts. We learned some of the usage patterns. We learned how S3 is implemented by Amazon. we learned how to create an S3 bucket.